In last week's video, we considered the propriety of marriage. Contrary to the idea that celibacy was mandatory, Paul showed that it was necessary and legitimate that people be married, and within that they lead a normal and full married life in all of its aspects. But Paul himself was unmarried. So how did he square that with his teaching on marriage? Well, we'll read about it in 1 Corinthians chapter 7 and verses 7 to 11. For I would that all men were even as I myself, but every man hath his proper gift of God, one after this manner, and another after that. I say therefore to the unmarried and widows, it is good for them if they abide even as I. But if they cannot contain, let them marry, for it is better to marry than to burn. And unto the married I command, yet not I, but the Lord, let not the wife depart from her husband. But, and if she depart, let her remain unmarried, or be reconciled to her husband, and let not the husband put away his wife. One of the important life lessons that my late wife Elizabeth taught me was that every good idea that I might have has to be played out in the real world. And I think that we see that good sense approach in these verses. Paul himself was celibate, and he believed that it would be good if everyone could follow that course. I would that all men were even as I myself, he writes in this chapter. But at the same time, Paul lived in the real world, and he recognized that every man hath his proper gift of God in verse 7. That is, whether he could remain single or needed to be married. So Paul recognized that whether to marry or not was very much an individual thing. It was not a one-size-fits-all thing. Not everyone can bear being unmarried, and the Lord Jesus also recognized that when he spoke of people being eunuchs for the kingdom of heaven's sake. It was only for he that is able to receive it, Matthew chapter 19 verse 12. Not everyone can. Indeed, Paul goes on to say that if a not married person struggles to remain in that condition, they are at liberty to be married or to be remarried. He says it is better to marry than to burn in verse 9. So Paul makes a very important point about those who are unmarried and widows in verse 8. That is, those who have never been married and those who are again unmarried, perhaps following bereavement. Paul tells us it is good for them if they abide even as I in verse 8. Paul calls their condition good and indicates that people in such a position, they don't need our pity but rather our encouragement and support in their good position. It's not a fault in someone if they're unmarried, although far too many people act as if it was. We should be ashamed of ourselves if that is our idea. But here's another point for the married. While it is good to be unmarried, that gives no license whatsoever for those who are married to break up. Let not the wife depart from her husband, Paul writes in verse 10. Just as the Lord gave teaching on this subject, Paul's instruction to husbands and wives is don't separate or divorce. But again, Paul is in the real world, and he goes on to write about a situation where separation has occurred. He doesn't prescribe in what circumstances that might have happened. He is clear, but and if she depart, let her remain unmarried, that is, to another person, or be reconciled to her husband in verse 11. So in summary, what Paul has taught so far in this chapter is, first, that marriage is honourable and it involves obligations that must be discharged. Second, that if you're unmarried, don't be in a hurry to marry, but where must needs it is an honourable course. And third, if you are married, you ought to continue in that marriage and remain faithful to the vows that you have taken in respect of your spouse.